Losing my hearing wasn't sudden. It was a slow, steady fade, like a song that gets softer and softer until you're not sure if you're imagining it playing. I was 32 when the doctors finally confirmed it. A rare condition, irreversible. At first, I fought it. Hearing aids, therapies, all the tools science had to offer. But eventually, I resigned myself to the silence. Life changed, but it didn't stop. My wife, Elise, became my world in ways I hadn't fully understood before. She was my bridge to a noisy world, my partner, my interpreter. I marveled at her patience, the way she adapted to our new reality without missing a beat. Or so I thought. One ordinary morning, I woke up with a strange, piercing noise in my ears. It startled me. I hadn't heard anything for years. The sound sharpened, became clearer, and before I could comprehend what was happening, I realized I could hear. It was faint, like a voice at the end of a tunnel, but it was there. I didn't say anything to Elise at first. The shock of regaining something I'd thought was lost forever left me hesitant. Instead, I spent the day listening, absorbing. It was overwhelming. The hum of the refrigerator, the rustle of paper, the distant drone of a car engine. I felt like a ghost in my own home, rediscovering a life I thought I'd left behind. But what I heard that night shattered the fragile joy of my regained hearing. That evening, as Elise worked in the kitchen, I sat quietly on the living room couch, trying to focus on the book in my lap. I hadn't told her about my hearing yet. I wasn't ready. The novelty of sound felt too fragile, as though speaking it aloud might somehow undo the miracle. Elise's voice floated from the kitchen, crisp and clear. At first, it was comforting, like revisiting a long-lost melody. I could hear the rhythmic clatter of dishes and her familiar humming. Then her words stopped me cold. "I can't keep living like this, Katie," she said. The name startled me. Katie was Elise's closest friend, her confidant. They'd been inseparable for years. Elise had her on speakerphone, the sound traveling freely through the house. "It's been so hard," Elise continued, her voice tight with emotion. "He's sweet, and I love him, but I feel like I've lost myself. And I've found someone else." I froze, my heart pounding as I strained to hear every word. Katie's response was softer, harder to make out, but I caught enough. "Elise, this is serious. Are you sure? What about Jack?" "Jack." "Me." Elise sighed, her voice carrying the weight of years. "It's not just about me anymore. Deputy Harris, he makes me feel alive in a way I haven't felt in years. And Jack, well, he doesn't even know what I'm going through. He's been so absorbed in his own world, his silence." I sat there, stunned, the book slipping from my hands. Elise's words carved into me like a blade. She sounded so distant, as if she were already gone. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, my ears ringing from the weight of what I'd just heard. I wanted to believe I'd misunderstood, that maybe I was piecing together fragments of a conversation out of context. But deep down, I knew better. Elise's voice softened, her tone more intimate now. "Harris understands me, Katie. He listens. He looks at me like I'm someone worth noticing." She hesitated, as though weighing her next words carefully. "I've made up my mind. I'm going to tell Jack soon." The clatter of a dish in the sink jolted me from my thoughts. I rose from the couch and took a shaky step toward the kitchen, my bare feet brushing against the hardwood floor. Every sound seemed amplified, each creak of the floorboards echoing louder than it should. The idea of confronting her now terrified me. What would I say? How would she look at me, knowing I'd overheard? Instead, I turned away, retreating to the quiet sanctuary of our bedroom. My thoughts churned as I paced the small space, replaying the conversation over and over. How long had she been feeling this way? How had I missed it? And Deputy Harris, the man who waved at us every Sunday morning from his squad car, How long had he been part of her world in a way I wasn't? I glanced at the framed photograph on our nightstand, Elise and me on our wedding day. Her smile had been brighter than the sun that afternoon, and her hand had fit perfectly in mine. I'd been so certain then, so sure we'd always be each other's anchor. Now, the ground beneath me felt like quicksand. I stayed in the bedroom for hours, replaying her words, letting them twist and stab in different ways. My mind kept circling back to one question: how had we gotten here? I thought back to the years we'd spent together, the countless memories that made up our lives. It hadn't always been like this. There had been laughter, passion, a connection so deep I thought nothing could break it. But now, hearing Elise speak of me as if I were a distant stranger, I felt like a man waking up in a life he didn't recognize. We'd met in college, two small-town kids navigating the sprawling maze of a big city campus. She was bold where I was cautious, charming where I was reserved. It wasn't just her beauty, though she was beautiful, but the way she saw the world, with an openness that made every mundane moment feel extraordinary. She had been my light, my anchor when life felt overwhelming. Our early years together had been a whirlwind of late-night conversations, road trips to nowhere, and dreams of building a future. When my hearing began to fade, she was there, steady and unwavering. She held my hand through the appointments, learned sign language alongside me, and assured me we'd adapt. And we did, or at least I thought we had. But had I leaned on her too much? Had the weight of my silence been heavier than I realized? I could feel doubt creeping in, whispering that maybe I was to blame for this distance between us. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, when the door creaked open. Elise peeked in, her face softening into a smile when she saw me. She looked tired, like she'd been carrying her own burdens for too long. "Hey," she said. "I didn't see you in the living room. Everything okay?" I nodded automatically, my heart thundering in my chest. Her words from earlier replayed in my mind. He looks at me like I'm someone worth noticing. "I was just tired," I managed, my voice steady despite the storm inside. She crossed the room and sat beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her presence. Her hand rested on my knee, a simple gesture that once would have filled me with comfort. Now, it felt like a stranger's touch. "I know things have been hard lately," she said, her voice gentle. "But I want you to know I'm here. I always will be." The weight of her hypocrisy pressed down on me. How could she sit here, so calm and composed, while planning to leave me for another man? I wanted to confront her, to force her to admit the truth, but something held me back. Maybe it was fear of what would happen if I shattered the fragile illusion of normalcy between us. Instead, I gave a tight smile and placed my hand over hers. "Thanks," I said, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. She stayed a moment longer before standing and heading to the bathroom, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. That night, as I lay in bed next to her, listening to her steady breathing, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront her yet. Not until I had a plan. If she wanted to keep secrets, I would too. And when the time came, I would be ready. The days that followed were a blur of quiet observations and buried emotions. Elise went about her routines with a grace that almost made me doubt what I'd heard. She smiled, laughed at my attempts to joke in sign language, and curled up next to me on the couch at night. But now, every gesture felt rehearsed, a performance for an audience of one. And I played my part. I kept my newfound hearing a secret, pretending to rely on lip reading and vibrations like I always had. It gave me the advantage of invisibility, of being present without being noticed. I began to watch Elise more closely, noting the way her expressions changed when she thought I wasn't looking. The moments of hesitation before she spoke. The flickers of guilt in her eyes. On Wednesday evening, she announced she was meeting Katie for dinner. She kissed me on the cheek before she left, her lipstick leaving a faint smudge on my skin. "Don't wait up," she said, her voice casual, almost too casual. As soon as the door clicked shut behind her, I moved. My pulse raced as I grabbed my keys and headed for the car. Following her felt like stepping into a spy movie, but I didn't care. I had to know the truth. Her car led me downtown, to a small restaurant tucked between a bookstore and a florist. I parked a few spaces away and watched as she stepped out of her car, her dress catching the light from the street lamps. She wasn't meeting Katie. A tall man in a deputy's uniform emerged from the shadows and greeted her with a warm, familiar smile. Harris. His name had felt like an abstraction when I'd overheard her say it, but now he was real, standing in front of me with the easy confidence of someone who knew they'd won. They entered the restaurant together, his hand brushing against her lower back. The sight made my stomach churn. I sat frozen in the car, unsure whether to storm in after them or drive away. Instead, I waited. After what felt like hours, they emerged. Elise laughed at something Harris said, her head tilting back in a way I hadn't seen in years. He opened her car door for her, and she hesitated, looking at him with an intensity that made my chest ache. Then she got in, and they drove off. That night, when she returned home, I pretended to be asleep. The mattress dipped as she climbed into bed, her movements careful not to disturb me. She didn't know I was awake, my mind racing with the weight of what I'd seen. The next morning, Elise hummed in the kitchen, the melody light and carefree, as though the previous night hadn't happened. I watched her from the doorway, a mug of coffee warming my hands. Every note of her hum grated against me, like sandpaper on raw skin. "Good morning," she said brightly when she noticed me, her smile as radiant as ever. She looked so normal, so unburdened, it was almost enough to make me doubt what I'd seen. Almost. I forced a smile. "Morning." For the next few days, I said little, trying to piece together what to do next. I couldn't ignore what I'd witnessed or the conversation I'd overheard, but the thought of confronting her without a plan felt reckless. I needed more. I needed the full truth. On Friday, Elise left for what she called an afternoon with Katie. I waited until I heard her car pull out of the driveway before I slipped into the office where she kept her laptop. My hands trembled as I opened the screen. She rarely locked it, trusting that I couldn't hear and wouldn't snoop. The faint click of the keys echoed in my ears as I searched through her emails and messages. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Exchanges with coworkers, reminders for appointments, but then I found them. Hidden in a folder labeled Work Notes were messages that shattered any lingering doubts. She and Harris had been exchanging emails for months, their tone growing more intimate with each message. At first, they seemed harmless, small, friendly chats about local events, but eventually, the language shifted. Phrases like, "I can't stop thinking about you," and "You make me feel alive again," painted a picture of a relationship far deeper than friendship. I scrolled further, my breath catching as I read a message from Elise that was dated just 2 weeks ago. "Harris, I don't know how much longer I can keep this secret. Every time I see Jack, I feel torn in two. But when I'm with you, everything feels so right. I know what I need to do. I just need the courage to do it." The words burned into my mind, each one a betrayal. I shut the laptop and sat back, the room spinning around me. This wasn't just an affair, it was a plan. A plan to leave me behind, to abandon everything we'd built. The sound of her car returning startled me. I quickly left the office, retreating to the living room and pretending to read a book. When she walked through the door, I glanced up and smiled as naturally as I could. "How was your afternoon?" "It was nice," she said, setting her bag down on the counter. "Katie and I tried that new cafe on Main Street. You'd love their pastries. I'll take you next time." Her light cut deeper than I expected. I nodded, feigning interest. Sounds good. That evening, I sat across from her at the dinner table, watching as she talked about her day. The way her eyes sparkled when she laughed, the way she reached for my hand out of habit, it all felt surreal. She was still my wife, but now I saw her differently. The connection we'd once shared felt like a fragile thread, frayed and ready to snap. But what haunted me most was her ease. She wasn't a woman riddled with guilt or regret. She was someone who had already made her decision, and was just waiting for the right moment to act. Later that night, as we lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling while she slept beside me. The sound of her breathing, once a comfort, now felt like a reminder of the growing distance between us. I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. I couldn't pretend I didn't know, couldn't ignore the reality of her betrayal. But how do you confront someone who has already moved on in her heart? How do you fight for a love that seems one-sided? The answers didn't come that night, but I knew one thing. I needed to confront her. Not in anger or desperation, but with the truth. And I needed to do it soon, before the cracks in our marriage became irreparable. The days leading up to my confrontation with Elise were some of the longest of my life. I replayed her words, her actions, and the evidence I had uncovered, trying to piece together the right way to approach her. My emotions swung between anger, sadness, and an odd, hollow sense of inevitability. She had made her choice, but now it was time for her to face it. It was a quiet Saturday morning when I decided I couldn't wait any longer. The sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the table where Elise sat with her coffee. She looked peaceful, almost serene, as she flipped through a magazine. "Elise," I said, my voice steady but firm. She glanced up, smiling. "Morning. Want me to make you some coffee?" I shook my head. "We need to talk." Her smile faltered, and she set the magazine down, her posture stiffening. "What's wrong?" I sat across from her, folding my hands on the table to steady them. "I need you to be honest with me," I began. "I know about you and Harris." Her face froze, the color draining from her cheeks. For a moment, she said nothing, her lips parting as though to speak but no sound coming out. What are you talking about?" she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto hers. "I can hear, Elise. For weeks now. I heard your conversation with Katie. I saw the emails. I know you've been seeing him." She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. You can hear?" "Yes," I said simply, the weight of the admission filling the room. "And now I want to hear the truth from you. No lies, no excuses. Just the truth." Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked away, her hands trembling on the table. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, her voice shaking. "It started as nothing, a few conversations, small moments. But then, I don't know, Jack. I just felt so lost." "Lost?" I repeated, my voice calm but edged with steel. "Lost enough to turn to someone else? Lost enough to lie to me?" Tears spilled down her cheeks as she looked back at me. "I didn't want to hurt you. I swear I didn't. But it felt like we were drifting apart, like I was invisible. And Harris, he noticed me. He made me feel seen." Her words stung, sharp and deep. "You think I didn't notice you?" I asked, my voice rising slightly. "You think I didn't see you? Elise, I've spent years trying to adapt to this life, to be the husband you deserve. And instead of talking to me, instead of trying to fix this together, you went to him?" She flinched at the accusation, her tears flowing freely now. "I didn't know how to tell you," she whispered. "I was scared." "Scared of what?" I asked, my anger giving way to a crushing sadness. "That I wouldn't understand? That I wouldn't fight for us? Elise, I love you. But love isn't blind. I see what's happening, and it's breaking me. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I didn't want it to get this far, she said. I didn't want to lose you. I sat back, the weight of her words pressing down on me. But you have to see that you already have, I said quietly. The moment you chose him over us, you lost me. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stood, my legs shaky beneath me, and turned toward the door. Jack, wait, she pleaded, her voice raw with desperation. What happens now? Can we fix this? I paused, my hand on the doorframe. I don't know, I said, not turning back to face her. But I need time. And so do you. I left the house, the door clicking shut behind me, and walked into the crisp morning air. The sky was clear, the world oblivious to the storm raging inside me. For hours, I drove aimlessly, my thoughts a chaotic tangle of memories, doubts, and questions. Could I forgive her? Could we rebuild what we had lost? And even if we could, would it ever be the same? By the time I returned home that evening, the house was quiet. Elisa's car was still in the driveway, but the lights were off, and the shadows stretched long across the walls. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the knob. Steeling myself, I stepped inside. Elise was sitting on the couch, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She looked up at me, her expression a mix of hope and fear. Jack, she began, her voice trembling. I'm so sorry. For everything. I nodded slowly, the weight of her apology settling over me. We'll talk, I said, my tone measured. But not tonight. I need to think. And so do you. She didn't protest, only nodded and watched as I retreated to the bedroom. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, one thought echoed louder than the rest. Whatever came next, it would change us forever. The days following our confrontation were filled with an uneasy quiet. Elise kept her distance, speaking only when necessary, her voice stripped of its usual warmth. I stayed busy, pouring myself into tasks around the house to avoid the weight of her presence. Each passing moment felt like the ticking of a clock, counting down to a decision neither of us was ready to make. One evening, after days of silence, Elise approached me as I sat on the porch watching the sunset. She carried 2 mugs of tea, offering one to me as she settled into the chair beside mine. I know you don't want to talk, she began, her voice soft. But I can't keep pretending everything's okay. We need to figure out where we go from here. I stared out at the horizon, the fading light casting long shadows across the yard. Where do you want to go, Elise? I asked, my voice steady. You've already started building a life with him. Do you even want to try to fix this? Her fingers tightened around her mug, and she let out a shaky breath. I don't know, she admitted. I thought I did. I thought Harris was the answer to something I couldn't put into words. But after everything, I realize I don't know what I want anymore. I turned to face her, searching her expression for any sign of the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. That's not good enough, I said quietly. You can't leave me in limbo while you figure it out. You need to choose, him or me. Tears welled in her eyes, and she looked away. It's not that simple, she whispered. It is that simple, I said firmly. You don't get to have both. If you want to rebuild what we had, it'll take everything we've got. But if your heart is with him, then say it. Let me go. She didn't respond immediately, her silence stretching into the cool evening air. Finally, she set her mug down on the porch railing and met my gaze. I don't deserve you, Jack, she said, her voice trembling. You've given me so much and I betrayed that. I don't know how to fix it. I don't know if I can. The honesty in her words cut through me, leaving a raw ache in its wake. For the first time, I saw her not as the woman who had betrayed me, but as someone who was just as lost as I was. Then maybe we start there, I said, my voice softening. With the truth. No more hiding, no more pretending. If there's any chance for us, it has to start with honesty. She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. Okay, she whispered. I'll try. I'll do whatever it takes. That night, we sat at the kitchen table, laying everything out in the open. She told me about her feelings of isolation, her struggles to adapt to the life we'd built after I lost my hearing. She confessed how Harris had become a confidant, someone who seemed to understand her in ways she felt I couldn't. It was painful to hear, each word like a dagger to the heart. But as she spoke, I realized something important. Her betrayal, while devastating, wasn't entirely about me. It was about her own fears and insecurities, the cracks in her identity that had been growing long before Harris entered the picture. When it was my turn, I told her about the pain of feeling useless, the shame of needing her help for even the simplest tasks, and the guilt of not noticing her struggles. I admitted that I had taken her for granted, assuming she would always be there, even as I retreated further into my own silence. By the time we were done, the sun had long since set, and the kitchen was bathed in the soft glow of the overhead light. The air between us felt different, still heavy, but no longer suffocating. I'm not saying I forgive you, I said finally, my voice steady. And I'm not saying we'll be okay. But if we both want this, really want this, then maybe we can start over. She reached across the table, her hand trembling as it rested on mine. I do want this, she said, her voice thick with emotion. More than anything. And I'll spend the rest of my life proving it to you if I have to. Her words carried a flicker of hope, fragile but real. I wasn't sure if it would be enough to rebuild what we'd lost, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like we had a chance. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Forgiveness wasn't a single decision. It was a choice I had to make every day, a constant battle between anger and hope. Elise was patient, though, more patient than I'd expected. She didn't push, didn't demand my trust. Instead, she focused on rebuilding it, brick by careful brick. She ended things with Harris the day after our conversation. She didn't hide it from me either. I watched her sit at the kitchen table with her phone, her voice steady as she told him it was over. There were no tears, no dramatics, just a quiet finality that left me feeling both relieved and hollow. I'm sorry, she said when she hung up, her eyes meeting mine. For everything. I know, I replied. It was all I could manage, but it seemed to be enough. We started therapy shortly after, both individual and couples sessions. Sitting across from a stranger and laying bare the most painful parts of our lives was awkward at first, but it forced us to confront the things we'd been avoiding for years. Elise opened up about her feelings of invisibility, her fear of being trapped in a life where she was only a caretaker. I shared the guilt I carried, the feeling that I had failed her by not being enough. One day, during a particularly raw session, Elise turned to me, her voice trembling. I don't expect you to ever forget what I did, Jack. But I hope one day you can believe that I'm still the woman you fell in love with. I want to be that woman again, for you and for myself. Her words stayed with me long after the session ended. She was trying, in ways I hadn't seen before. She'd stopped going out late, stopped making excuses. Instead, she'd focused on small, thoughtful gestures, cooking my favorite meals, leaving notes on my desk, holding my hand during movies. But it wasn't just her that needed to change. I had to confront my own role in what had happened. I had spent years retreating into my silence, letting her carry the emotional weight of our relationship. If we were going to make this work, I couldn't keep hiding. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, I turned to her. You were right, I said, my voice quiet. She looked at me, confused. About what? About us being stuck. About me not seeing what you needed. I don't know how I missed it, but I did. And I'm sorry. Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached for my hand. You didn't miss it, she said. I didn't tell you. I should have, but I didn't know how. We sat there in silence, the weight of our shared regrets heavy between us. But there was something else, too, a sense of possibility, of rebuilding. Months passed, and life slowly found a new rhythm. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, still echoes of what had happened. But there were also moments of connection, of laughter, of rediscovery. One night, as we lay in bed, Elise turned to me, her voice soft in the darkness. Do you think we'll ever be okay again? I thought about it for a moment before answering. I think we'll be different, I said. But maybe that's not a bad thing. She nodded, her fingers brushing against mine. Different is good, as long as we're together. In that moment, I believed her.